Welcome to your first mini lecture in Ed 215. We're going to start with Chapter 9, which is Adolescence. This chapter, or this unit, I should say, is broken into 2 different weeks. So we're going to go ahead and start with the physical development and then go into cognitive development and socially emotional development. So starting with physical development, this is a time of great change. Adolescence is defined as the developmental stage between childhood and adulthood. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that the beginning of the stage as well as the ending of the stage are rather imprecise. A lot of this has to do with the timing of the pubertal changes that happen. So we're kind of, when it starts and when it ends is really dependent upon the child. So when we look at physical maturation, these are some of the big changes that will happen for boys and girls. The growth spurt is huge. You're going to see extreme changes in height and weight, as I've said, throughout the lifespan. Infancy is very fast. Childhood is pretty much steady. You get to middle, late childhood. It's the calm before the storm. Here's the storm of adolescence. So you're going to see extreme changes in height and weight. It would not be uncommon to see a child go home over summer break and then come back and look like a totally different child. You're going to see boys growing about 4 inches a year, girls growing about 3.5 inches a year. And you will see some gender differences here. This is when we talk about the timing of puberty. You're going to see that girls often begin this about 2 years earlier, so they're going to be taller than the boys in their class. So by 13, the boys are going to catch up, and they are taller, but for a while, you're going to see those gender differences. When we look at all of the puberty changes, these are basically the maturation of the sexual organs. And it's going to often, again, follow that same timing pattern, happening earlier for girls than it does for boys. It is all controlled by the pituitary gland. We call it the master gland in the brain. It pretty much kicks everything off by the secretion of hormones. And girls are going to be beginning right around 11 or 12, so the end of elementary school, beginning of middle school. And boys are going to be 13 to 14. And you see a huge change in all sorts of development then. So there's a lot of talk about what actually triggers puberty. Environment is definitely a factor because you are what you eat. And one of the things they've talked about in environment is the nutrition value of our food and potentially the growth hormones that is given to animals that we in turn eat, that sort of thing, that there's a transference. We also look at cultural factors, which could be ethnicity, or it could also be just the way that you are raised, because one thing that we do know is that for girls going through puberty, their first menstruation is going to be often triggered by a certain level of body fat to muscle ratio. So what they eat, and as well as what the family can provide, you see how culture, social economic status, nutrition, all of those things can come into play. And the other thing that we mentioned is the secular trend. The secular trend is basically looking at, we're seeing girls start their menstrual cycles earlier. If we look at, not that women want to have this conversation, but if we look at conversations that might be had between grandmothers and young girls, we're seeing an average of about 4 months per decade in difference starting earlier. So that is definitely something that is a thing. The process itself involves both primary and secondary sex characteristics. You want to know the difference between these because your primaries are basically everything that is related to reproduction. Secondary, on the other hand, is going to be things that are going to distinguish between being male and female. So, for example, breast development or facial hair, things like that. Things that distinguish you being man or woman and looking more like a man or woman, but not directly related to reproduction. I've talked about timing and I talked about the gender differences. Body image is one of those things that go right along with that. An adolescent's reactions to their physical changes is going to be largely dependent upon what their expectation is. And their expectation is also going to vary with timing. So we have people who develop early and people who develop late. Most tend to be pretty happy with their development, but timing really is key. So for girls, they find that if they go through puberty early, it's often difficult because they often are too popular, maybe because of the fact that they are developing and looking much older than they are. So they are attracting the attention, sometimes unwanted, of the older boys. The reactions do depend on cultural norms, and it's basically social comparison as well. They're looking at what other people are doing. For late maturing girls, it's a little complicated. There's definitely some good things like focusing on academics, but also they feel left out, or they feel like they're not getting the attention that they are desiring, that sort of thing. So there's definitely positives and negatives that come with the timing of puberty for girls. When we look at boys, on the other hand, they actually are much happier to go through maturation early. And the reason why I say that is because they are already behind girls. And if you think of the things that make boys, quote, popular, athletic ability, or being taller or more muscular, which are all part of puberty as well. They tend to have a much more positive self-esteem if they develop early. They tend to be more involved in sports. And then you've got the late maturation that is difficult for boys. They're small, they're seen as smaller, they're less attractive, they don't have the advantage in sports. As you can see, a lot of these things are body image as well as self-esteem issues. One thing that often comes up as an issue with puberty, especially for girls, is potential for eating disorders. So the growth spurt takes a lot of food, basically, to fuel that growth. However, obesity is an issue. When you look at the rates, adolescents 1 in 3 are overweight, 1 in 20 are obese, and there's a lot of psychological consequences to this body image. And then anytime we talk about obesity, there's going to be the potential health concerns as well. Blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, that sort of thing. So the last thing I want to talk about in physical development is the anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia is an eating disorder where they just do not eat. They often deny their behavior. They often have a body dysmorphic disorder where they see themselves different than what they actually do. They deny their behavior as abnormal. They call it normal. And it's very common in white women who have a lot of control exerted over their life. So this is their one thing that they can control. And often that is, like I said, it's psychological in nature. And then lastly is bulimia. This is also an eating disorder, very different. It's binge and purge behavior. It could be also use of laxatives or vomiting. This one is dangerous because of the chemical imbalance it produces. So both of them are considered very, dangerous conditions, but they affect different ways. So you want to know the difference between those two. Okay. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will go to the next video.